And now, back to the man who's never afraid to throw virtual hands, the social media samurai, the tyrant of Twitter, the keyboard snatcher of souls, Tim Graham and friends.
Who's in the NFL here? You? You? How about you, Tim? You, Tim.
What the hell happened this week? We're going to try to sort it out. And how about this? In the background, the Sabres just keep doing great things, just the way you thought 2026 was going to start. It's Tim Graham and friends. I'm Tim Graham of The Athletic here with Jonah Bronstein of Bronstein Sports Plus. And stability within both Pegula sports enterprises, I guess, is just not possible. And the Buffalo Sabres trying to work their way up the playoff seeding ladder, doing a hell of a job. They keep winning. Another victory in Montreal. But the Buffalo Bills not engendering much confidence. Now, all of this can be rendered moot in a week when we see who the Bills' next head coach is, or I guess if they wait until after the Super Bowl, maybe in a couple of weeks. But with the announcement on Monday that Sean McDermott has been fired while Brandon Beane has been promoted, Wednesday's news conference in which Terry Pegula cannot articulate why that is, why one man was detached from the other, and at some point these guys went from in lockstep to in totally different orbits in Terry Pegula's universe, to the Keon Coleman mess, to a job search that is including any manner and of coaching candidate. Philip Rivers, he's a high school coach, for Christ's sakes. He was just playing for the Colts a couple of months ago, and he's getting an interview with the Pegulas. Josh Allen's involved in these discussions. We're going to try to sort it all out. Jonah and I didn't come up with an outline for this show because I think talking about it is fun this way. And we're just going to pull on the different threads and see where we go. But Jonah, your overview on the week that was for the Buffalo Bills.
Well, I thought we were going to lead with the Bandits being on a 2-game losing streak and what that means for the Pegula operation, and Jessie Pegula winning her first 2 matches at the Australian Open in straight sets, and the dichotomy there of all these Pegula franchises all over the world. But I guess if you want to start with the Bills, I can go back in my notes and try to think about what was said. Yeah, I don't know. It was one of the more interesting days on the job that I can remember. And maybe the last time it was that interesting, maybe a Kevin Adams press conference here or there, but Doug Whaley and what he was privy to 9 years ago and how contentious that news conference got. And this one wasn't as contentious, but the reaction from the fans was quite similar to that. And the national heat that the Bills took over the way they failed to explain, the way Terry Pegula failed to explain his thinking and his positions, and unfortunate commentary on Keon Coleman. Overall, I mean, I would say I appreciated it. I think the big news of the day was that Terry Pegula sat down and spoke to the media, that he has not spoken to the press in a Q&A setting like that for either of his teams in 6 years, and it's been longer at that with the Bills, and he's never sat down at that table postseason and taken that kind of end-of-season exit interview question and answer period like that. And just about everything he said, I think, was newsworthy because of the fact that he speaks so infrequently, but also the candor and genuine insight that he tried to provide. He's not a charismatic speaker. He is not the most articulate business person or sports owner or speaker in general. So it was confusing at times, but I think he tried to explain as best as he could. And in some ways, if you pick apart or put different quotes together, I think you did get a little bit of understanding of why he made the moves or why he's going in the direction he's going. But you had to speak that particular Pegula language or have your translating app to help you out there. But I will say this, there's a lot of criticism for what Pegula said, for saying too much, for answering questions that weren't asked of him. shouldn't have said this. How can an owner ever say that? It's embarrassing that he says that. I get that position from the Bills PR standpoint and from some of the Bills organization and fans. But from my perspective, or the average person's perspective, or the NFL fan looking for entertainment and insight, I think it was tremendous. I'm never going to take the woe is PR standpoint on something like this, and I hope we get more of this from Terry Pegula, more of this from the Bills. I feel like we learned more about the Bills and their thinking from this hour-long news conference than in the entire series of Hard Knocks. And, I thought it
You're
was
saying this,
insightful.
Jonah, as a bit of as a journalist, as somebody who wants information, and also as a fan of entertainment. It was highly entertaining, our news conference, because there was so much to learn. I was riveted, and there did not have to be any sensationalized questions or pointed questions. Every question was a genuine curiosity. Fill in the blanks for us. And to me, that is pure journalism. I think a lot of reporters went into that news conference. It was packed house, by the way. People who usually have their seats showed up and found out that it was long ago taken, and you're going to have to sit somewhere else, sir. I'm sorry that just because you cover the team regularly does not mean that you're guaranteed a seat in this news conference room. Um, Matthew Fairburn showed up, our Buffalo Sabres reporter, because he wasn't sure if Terry might say something Sabres related. On Matt on his way to Montreal stopped by. That was nice to see. Um,
And a note on that, I got there half an hour before the start of the press conference, and usually I'm not late, but I'm a little later than that for a normal Bills media day and can find a seat. And all the seats were taken. I ended up sitting in someone's seat who was a camera person standing, but it was full house
the
more than
security
30
door opened
minutes.
at 8:30, and I got there at 8:30 because I knew it was going to be tough, perhaps, and there were already people in there. So yeah, I get that. I get that. It was entertaining, and I think, but from a fan standpoint, we heard from Hall of Fame Joe Lazito, or at least I did in my text. I asked him what he thought, and he said it was terrifying to listen to that news conference because the juxtaposition of these men explaining Sean McDermott being fired and then realizing that these are the two men who are going to find his replacement. So again, not a woe is PR like you said, but woe is PR on this. I mean, this was not a good look for the Bills, and there is damage control that is being done at One Bills Drive and that needs to continue to happen, because I think that looking back on it, as strange as the Keon Coleman diversion was and all the different things that were said that don't add up, such as Brandon Beane saying that he didn't know about Sean McDermott being fired until Monday morning. And then the press release comes out at 10:30 and Brandon Beane has a promotion, as does Pete Gwelly, which would have to come with new contracts because there's all kinds of protocols. These guys went from being non-presidents to presidents within an NFL organization, and that comes with all kinds of different levels of access and clearances that you get at the league offices. So it's not like this was all done on the fly on Monday morning. Couldn't have been. But when you look back on the whole thing, you understand that the mission, the number one objective of that news conference on Wednesday wasn't to explain Sean McDermott. It was to protect Brandon Beane and to shield him from criticism because of all of the slings and arrows he absorbed in the previous 48 hours for finding a way to get promoted when Sean McDermott got fired. And it was to get him as much distance from this decision to fire Sean McDermott as possible. My fingerprints are not on this. This was Terry Pegula's decision, 100%. I didn't know until Monday morning. We didn't tell Josh Allen about it until after the fact. No, Terry made this decision purely on emotion, which also is probably where fans would be terrified that an owner makes this decision on a really good coach based on pure emotion and a visceral feeling based on what he saw of the emotional wreckage in that visitor's locker room in Denver. So that to me was what this press conference was about. And then you could see, well, that's why Terry stepped in and wanted to say something, what he thought was defensive of Brandon Beane regarding the Keon Coleman pick, but in the process really stepped in it with all the different inferences or what we could deduce from Terry needing to do that is saying that they're upset with this pick, that they don't, that if we had our druthers, we wouldn't have picked him. So anyways, so I get it. I get your how it was entertaining. And as a journalist, it was awesome. The numbers at The Athletic for my posts are astronomical. You had told me you've written 5 things off of this news conference this week. It's good for business. It's good for journalism. It's good for ESPN. How about this? How about this? Conference championship week, all kinds of coaching maneuvers being done, guys filling jobs, guys interviewing for jobs. At 6 o'clock on Wednesday, by now I'm at home. I'd filed one of my stories. I'm now home from Orchard Park, and I'm going to turn on Sports Center at 6 o'clock. And I'm not tuning in to see what they're saying about the Bills. I just want to see what they're talking about in the sports world. It's 6 o'clock, top of the hour, Sports Center can be talking about anything in the world sports related. And it is Terry Pegula on my screen at 6 p.m. Eastern time on ESPN Sports Center. And then they bring in Booger McFarland to talk about how they can possibly salvage their relationship with Keon Coleman, what is going on there. And then they throw it to the PTI set. So Tony Kornheiser and Michael Wilbon can talk about what everybody just watched in Orchard Park. This is the A block, the A-list dudes talking about what happened in Orchard Park and what a disaster it was. And the comment that really stood out to me was Michael Wilbon saying that if Terry Pegula really did fire Sean McDermott based on Denver, that is totally insane, was the word he used. So again, this is wild. But you're right. It is good for business. It's good for journalism. It's good for, I guess it's good for content, I should say.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's good for Bills fans and Bills fan culture, Buffalo sports, but I think it was necessary, and I think it was informative and answered questions that have been either unanswered or left open to interpretation in the past. Bills fans, they've been clamoring for Terry Pegula to speak on behalf of himself and his teams many times over the years. So I don't know why there's so much disdain for him actually coming out and doing that. Although I guess it's what he said.
I think it's the reminder that he's making the pick and that you now can eliminate. You used to be able to differentiate Sabres and Bills. And I tweeted this. It was the first thing the first words I put out into the universe after McDermott was fired and Beane was promoted was a tweet that people would constantly ask me and you. We would be even together. We'd be out in public all kinds of times, our friends. How is it that the Sabres are run this way and the Bills are run this way? Meaning the Sabres are awful. The Bills are a model almost for the NFL, the rest of the NFL to try to emulate. And we would, explain the differentiate, how how the head coach and the general manager report to the owner individually, whereas the hockey team's different. And, but the upshot was always just be thankful the Bills are not run like the Sabres. We can't say that anymore. And I think that you used to be able to just be able to say McDermott and Beane are running things and Terry Pegula is letting that happen. And you don't need to worry about a Ron Ralston hire or a Tim Murray taking over or Pat LaFontaine quitting after 2 months or all the different craziness that you had. Kevin Adams' situation coming to the fore. But now all those examples are to be considered while the Bills go through this coaching search of, does this guy know what he's looking at when it comes to signing off on the right coach or the right leadership, or even in making the decision to get rid of McDermott? It's, who's in his ear? According to him, it's nobody. If Terry Pegula is to be believed, let's take it on face value. He made this decision by himself unilaterally. Well, then I think you call into question, well, this guy is running the Bills now, like he has run the Sabres. And I think every possibility is in play when it comes to Any example you want to use, you can go back and that Rex Ryan and getting hired and Doug Whaley not getting fired when Terry Pegula took over, Russ Brandon somehow surviving and then taking over also the Buffalo Sabres. There's all kinds of wacky moves that you look back on with both teams. And I think it is fair and appropriate to look at all of his hires, not just the fact that he does the Bills this way and he does the Sabres that way.
Yeah, I did think back this week to something you wrote maybe in 2020 about the differences in the Bills and the Sabres and how there was so much dysfunction in the Pegula operation around the Sabres. And you quoted somebody saying that, they didn't want that around the Bills or keep that away from the Bills program. And at this point in 2026, that's not the case. And I think
I heard from somebody tweeted it, I think, and I responded, "What a twist!" But yeah, now people are like, "Keep that, whatever's going on with the Bills, keep that away from our hockey team."
right.
We finally figured it out.
Yeah, and the Sabres seem like they are a much more professionally run organization now with their new general manager and Lindy Ruff and the way they're winning. And Terry Pegula is less visible at the hockey arena than in the football facility these days. So it sort of seems like that has flipped. Now, covering the team and seeing how often Terry's at practice and training camp and standing next to Brandon Beane or Sean McDermott talking to him, I don't know if there was ever a point in time when he was hands off. Maybe previously when Kim Pegula was the team president, there was a little bit of that. But I think he's been involved in many decisions, and I think that when Kevin Adams would talk about talking with Terry regularly and getting his input, I'm pretty sure Brandon Beane does that almost as much or just as much, and that's part of working for this ownership. So yeah, not to go in a completely different direction here, but one thing that really struck me this week was how shocking the Sean McDermott firing was, but wasn't or shouldn't have been in a way. I found it very surprising when I learned of it Monday morning. I don't feel like anybody in the local media saw it coming, and we were all rather surprised by it. We did a whole podcast a week or two ago explaining why we didn't think it was going to happen and why the national reporters were off base, speculating that that was going to happen if they had lost in the wild card game a week earlier. And when it did happen, the reaction to it, how many fans were upset about it. There was a poll, not a scientific poll, but there was a poll on WIBB.com and more than 5,000 votes, and 94% disapproved of the move to fire Sean McDermott.
94%. I didn't see that. Wow.
Yeah, and
that's a lot.
Right. And I don't think going into the Denver game, the playoff game, that Sean McDermott's job approval rating with Bills fans was 94%. It didn't feel that way. That 6% that didn't approve was more vocal than, the 94%. And
let me just quickly say about the disapproval. I don't mean to derail your train of thought, but I think that there are three aspects to the fan wonderment over this and their tolerance versus intolerance, I guess. Is Sean McDermott being fired in and of itself, I think fans, you would have probably gotten close to 50-50. That is just a guess. I mean, or it would not have been 94%. Sean McDermott being fired and Brandon Beane staying, I think, slants it a little bit.
Sure.
And I think the idea that McDermott got fired and Beane got promoted, given more power, that is what was just incongruous to the fans. And it's like, what is going on there? And then there you have the frustration of this doesn't make sense. Either these guys have to go together, fire them together, or maybe I think it probably would have been smarter for the Bills in this situation to fire McDermott, keep Beane, and 2 months down the road or after the draft announce he has been promoted, something like that. You'd have the new coach in play. you'd feel better probably about who the coach is because Josh Allen's involved in the process, and from a PR standpoint, he comes out and he says he's all for it. And if Josh is all for it, then the fans are going to be all for it. And then Brandon Beane getting his promotion, you kind of take a step back, and that would make sense. But in this moment, right after the game, for this to happen, and then the owner to not be able to articulate why, that's what, to use Joe Lazito's word again, is terrifying.
Yeah, I get that, and I'm sure that the the support that Sean McDermott is receiving is very much colored by people being upset that Brandon Beane kept his job, got promoted, won the power struggle, this, that, and the third. But I think Terry Pegula did a better job of explaining why Brandon Beane is staying in his role and gaining more power and influence than he did in anything related to Sean McDermott. Um, Whether you agree or not, I think he did lay that out, that he does believe that Brandon Beane has done well over the balance of 8 years in building the roster that's consistently good and certainly better than any stretch of roster building the Bills had before Brandon Beane came in. And also, he praised Brandon Beane for bringing in Joe Shane and Brian Gaine and Terrence Gray and other front office executives. And I think implicit in that was, or implied with that was, that he believes Brandon Beane will be able to hire a good head coach, that he is good at bringing in talent, whether it's been the players he's acquired or the assistant GMs that he's hired to work with him, and that Brandon Beane leading the search for the head coach will land more talent. And I think you can extrapolate that to the offensive coordinator and the defensive coordinator and the staff. And what you're seeing with the different people they're interviewing, I think they're doing a very thorough search that might be landing them their offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator from these head coaching interviews, and they're going to build a coaching staff that's similar to this front office staff, where the Bills have a general manager and Brandon Beane, president of football operations now, a former general manager helping him, and probably a future general manager helping him. And I don't know if they're going to have three head coaches, but they're going to have a full staff of coaching talent that I think Terry Pegula is looking forward to seeing what Brandon Beane can do. And Brandon Beane has been the general manager for 8 years, but he never got to hire a head coach. And Terry Pegula never said this, but I believe he was trying to imply that he believes Brandon Beane deserves the opportunity to hire a head coach and lead this franchise without Sean McDermott either having more power than him or their equal power. And I wouldn't be surprised if Pete Gwelly was involved in that and advising that this is how the best organizations in different sports are run, and give this a chance. A GM that hires a coach and the coach reports to the GM, and see if that works better than what was working very well for a long time, but didn't seem to work as well in the last year or so. And, Terry Pegula in that initial statement saying he was changing the leadership structure. Whether you agree with Brandon Beane's performance and deserving to get that promotion, I think that was the key phrase, that it's changing the structure, and Brandon Beane's the one that's going to lead that structure. But it was a bit more of a management reorganization than the actual personalities involved.
What was your take Wednesday as you were witnessing it and then had a chance to digest it on Terry Pegula's reasoning for firing Sean McDermott? And I set it up because I think that it was a strategy to take you into the theater of the mind that Josh Allen was dejected and the emotional wreckage within that locker room, and everybody was inconsolable, to the point where you can actually picture Terry Pegula placing his hand gently on Josh Allen's shoulder pads and saying, there, everything's going to be fine. That was a catch. And Josh Allen not looking up at him. Now, I did not have this on my list of questions, but I did have a chance to ask the first question at the news conference, and it stemmed from what we learned during these initial remarks from both Terry Pegula and Brandon Beane, in which Terry made it as though it was an emotional decision, which I think is not great. That's bad optics, that you made an emotional decision on the future of your football team that has been in very good hands, and that you're making this emotional decision and it might be justified, but to make an emotional decision, I think is, you know, terrifying. Um, so I asked the question, did how did you fire a coach based on a bad call? Because he kept reiterating that it was a bad call. And so if it was a bad call, therefore the Bills were in field goal position, therefore they win the game. Therefore, we're talking to Sean McDermott on Wednesday about what he thinks about the New England Patriots and going to Foxborough with a chance to go to the Super Bowl, as opposed to any other number of reasons Terry Pegula could have laid out. Now, in answering my question, he said, no, it wasn't a bad call. It was an accumulation of things. And he mentions 13 seconds and Tyler Bass's missed field goal and the catch, he keeps calling it. And you could also infer the inability for the tush push to get the first down and the bad spot and whatever last year against Kansas City. But these guys each had prepared statements in front of them. Now, maybe they strayed from them, maybe they ignored them, but they had documents in front of them, checklists, maybe entire speeches. I don't know. But they had stuff in front of them to go off of. And none of that was mentioned in the initial discussion. And so, yes, you can say, well, he eventually got around to explaining why he really fired Sean McDermott. But that's not how he chose to do it. He chose to emphasize emotion, the quarterback being upset. And to me, that then becomes the foundation for the decision. And that was what was thought out. That was what everybody decided. I'm guessing they all sat down before Terry Pegula came out at 10 a.m. or 10:30 or whatever time it was, and rolled out their explanation. What was your take on how they handled it, or the explanation? I guess how they explained it? Were you satisfied in any way about how it was explained?
No and yes. And I don't know if I can really explain this any better or much differently than you just did, but it didn't really add up with the prepared statement at the beginning. It did seem to be uh, a bit of a performance to try to uh, deflect the blame from Brandon Beane, to try to bring us into the mind of Terry Pegula and how he came to this decision and how it was his decision and his reaction and not an organizational decision or not made by the general manager. Whether that's true or not, it did seem to be that's what he was trying to convey. And he made more sense in the follow-up question, which I thought was, excellent and well timed by you to be like, wait a second, what did you just say? But the proverbial playoff wall was probably the most prescient comment about it. And that was, you can make a reasoned argument for the coaching change, that the Bills were 8-8 in the playoffs under Sean McDermott, and as great as his winning percentage was in the regular season, that's 500, and with the roster they've had, that's probably not good enough. That teams don't win the Super Bowl, that having that many years of success and not going to the Super Bowl, usually don't get over the hump later on in the tenure, that something needed to change. That doesn't really explain why Brandon Beane gets promoted, but I think you can explain why it was time to make a coaching change. A defensive head coach, and the defense has underperformed in the playoffs, specifically these playoff losses over and over again. There's been playoff wins where the defense has given up 30 plus points. As good as the defense has been in the regular season over the past 9 seasons, it was rarely that good in the playoffs or at the end of the season or against really, really good offenses in very important games that the Bills played. Maybe needing a change in defensive philosophy or defensive coaching, and that could not be done with Sean McDermott as the head coach. You could have made some sort of argument there. Terry Pegula is not a charismatic speaker who is not good at explaining himself. I think he might have had more logical reasoning within him than he was able to convey to us. Uh, he should have been assisted better in laying out this case. But as you mentioned, the goal of that press conference seemed to be for Terry Pegula to take the arrows and paint Brandon Beane in a better light when Brandon Beane was better suited to explain it. but they didn't want Brandon Beane taking any of the responsibility for firing Sean McDermott. And maybe there's some truth to that. I mean, I came away from that wondering if Brandon Beane was part of the decision to fire Sean McDermott, or really agreed with wanting to fire Sean McDermott.
That is a question we missed as the media assembled. And Derek Boyko, the executive in charge of communications, did try to end the news conference a little earlier. He did the, two more questions, and then we just kept going. And Brandon Beane and Terry Pegula sat there, and nobody was upset. And Derek kind of let it go for, I don't know what it would have been. What'd you guess? Another 10 or 15 minutes, it seemed like. So we did have a chance to ask, but kind of came up late regarding Brandon saying he didn't know until Monday morning. We should have followed up with, well, do you agree with the decision? Because I think the assumption being is that this was in the works for a long time. I mean, that's how it all adds up. But if you're going to say that you didn't know until Monday morning, what was your reaction when Terry told you? Did you push for Sean to stay? I think we would know that that's not true, but based on everything that we know. But yeah, nobody was really. Did you try to save Sean's job? Did you stick up for him? I mean, how did this conversation go?
Well,
but I don't think anybody believes that he really didn't find out until Monday morning anyway.
Right. Well, and another unasked and unanswered question was it possible to restructure the leadership organizational chart and have Brandon Beane move up to this president position and have autonomy over the head coach, and not have the coach and the general manager both reporting to the owner separately, but keeping Sean McDermott? Or was it, they wanted to restructure the leadership and give Brandon Beane this new title and a GM that does have autonomy over the coach, and because of the way it had been for the last 8-9 years, that wasn't possible with Sean McDermott as the coach, or Sean McDermott wasn't going to submit to that. I mean, I don't know if we would have gotten an answer to that question, but I think that's, still out there as an unknown. And, I want your take on this. Brandon Beane was asked about the perception that he won a power struggle, pulled a power play, and Terry Pegula interjected with his answer that he doesn't like power plays. And, I don't know how he feels about penalty kills, but he was very adamant that he doesn't like power plays, and that if you try to pull a power play, you're out. And I think we've seen that with business executives before that seem to be assuming too much power. And Terry Pegula just said, hey, you're gone, and we're going to bring somebody else in. And I wonder what you think about this. I do wonder if, without coming out and telling us, did he hint that Sean McDermott was trying for a power play, and that ultimately sealed Sean McDermott's ticket out of town, and that Brandon Beane survived because he was maybe smart enough to not do that?
At the very least, the friction that Sean McDermott was applying, the sandpaper that he was applying, especially towards the end of the season regarding the roster. And when I talk about the roster, it's really the backhanded compliments he was giving the opposition. He had roster envy. He was talking about, he went out of his way to talk about the Eagles' defensive line. That's how you win a Super Bowl. He went out of his way to talk about Jacoby Myers. He went out of his way to mention their hole that they had at cornerback, especially after the Week 18 exhibition game against the Jets, in which Maxwell Hairston and Tre'Davious White both had to play because they don't have enough cornerbacks on the roster after losing Jamarcus Ingram in the Darius Slay fiasco. So, and then also bringing up, the Jaguars, not only did they get Jacoby Myers at the trade deadline, but earlier in the season, they got Greg Newsome, the cornerback, and wow, how these guys can pull off these trades. And they're the type of things that McDermott used to say about Brian Dable, for instance, in a post-game news conference. He would talk about running the ball more, and he would just kind of emphasize the things that were really bothering him without mentioning anybody by name. And I'm sure that, and I've written about it, about all the things that McDermott said that had to have been getting under Brandon Beane's skin. And we can't keep operating like this. Similarly to how Stephon Diggs had to go, right? I mean, Stephon Diggs had to go because of all the little microaggressions, all the little things that started to get under everybody's skin, whether it be teammates or the coaching staff or the front office. Stephon Diggs's brother, saying, about getting Diggs up out of there and taking shots at Josh Allen, and Diggs not sticking up for his team or Buffalo as a city. And after a while, it's like Diggs has to go. I mean, it's just getting untenable. And so I think that it's not too much of a stretch to say that it was getting that way with Sean McDermott. And he was just speaking his backhanded truth a little bit too much. And then we heard, Vic Carucci and his reporting, and I think I know his source on that, and it's a source that I would trust, about the meeting 5 weeks ago in which Sean McDermott raised some concerns about the roster, and that Terry and Brandon were offended by that, and that was maybe the final straw. And so, and that's to bring in also, and it's a good time to mention this. This was a tweet from Richie Incognito. He challenged them and told the truth. Accountability made them uncomfortable. You don't win a Super Bowl unless everyone, including the GM, lives up to the standard. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is because it just plays to what I was just saying, that Sean McDermott challenged him based on Vic Carucci's report, and they didn't, and that the Bills didn't like it. The Bills management is the heat that Brandon Beane has taken from former players, and I think that you can infer from or deduce from current players. You have Taron Johnson on social media with SMH, and then he deleted it and posted something else. Jordan Phillips saying that it was sickening. Daquan Jones, there were some profanities in Daquan Jones's and too, I believe, in which he said, "You finally got what you wanted." Stevie Johnson, who didn't play for Sean McDermott, but this is, again, it has to hurt Brandon Beane's soul, in which Stevie Johnson, and I guess bonus points to Stevie for using Damon University because he knows his community and he spelled it right, to say that Damon University scientists had come up with a recreation of what Judas looked like. And it was a scientifically recreated, I'm sure he went on AI, and it was Brandon Beane of Judas. Judas Iscariot out of the freaking Bible. And if there's no shortage of Littlefinger references, Benedict Arnold, a snake, Brutus. I mean, Brandon Beane is being criticized deeply by current players, former players, NFL observers. Bruce Arians was on the Pat McAfee show on, I think it was Wednesday. I'm not sure. But he said, because Pat McAfee, I guess you can swear on television if you're on Pat McAfee's show. He said he was baffled by the decision, and the GM gets a fucking raise, was what Bruce Arians said. It's everybody, as maybe it was subconscious, as I literally am scratching my head. It's Brandon Beane is not a popular fella these days.
Yeah. And it's interesting because of course, remember how intertwined they were. Mick Bean, it always seemed like they were this partnership, and that I think that's why we all felt like the day one of them got fired, if that ever came, they would both be going out. There would be a new GM and coach marriage, and that really couldn't imagine a Bills organization with a different GM but the same coach, or a different coach but the same GM. I wonder what the reaction would have been. I guess Bills fans might have appreciated it more if they changed GMs and kept Sean McDermott. But that would have been a bit of an awkward situation, I think, too. I think the best way to do this is either to change, regime completely, and then have a new GM come in and hire the coach. Or the second best way is probably this way, to have Brandon Beane hire a new coach, see how that works, and then if that doesn't work, you remove the general manager and let a new general manager make a decision on the coach. Because a lot of people see something coming where the Bills underperform next year and Brandon Beane takes the fall for that. But then you have a awkward situation where a new GM comes in with a coach that he didn't hire.
Right.
And I think until you get aligned with a general manager hiring the coach, you're going to have these power struggles. They're just implicit to the job. And I know Brandon
You're
Beane,
going to have constantly uneven leverage between the general manager and the coach.
right?
And
Yeah.
I have, I agree with that. And I have an example an anecdote that really kind of sums up how I feel about it. And it was the summer of 2017. Sean McDermott is the new head coach, and Brandon Beane is the new general manager. And I'm doing the life and times story, as we like to call it in the business, on each of these guys, and where it's you talk to everybody, the high school coach, the parents, the friends, whatever. You try to find out and get a sense as to who this guy is, a profile. And I did one on McDermott and one on Brandon Beane. And for each one of them, I interviewed their parents. And each mother asked me the same question at the end of their interviews. And it was, do you think they'll win? Do you think they'll do it? Just as mothers would, right? They're worried. This is their son is finally getting this big break. NFL head coach, NFL general manager. Here it is. And now they're talking to the journalist who's based in Buffalo. They're still trying to figure out what Buffalo is. And so they say, can they do it? Do you think it'll work? And in those moments, I don't remember which mother asked me first. So when I had a chance to talk to the second one, I just repeated it. But I told him the same thing. I don't know if it's going to work, because I'm not going to lie to you, Mrs. Bean or Mrs. McDermott, and tell you I'm not going to pander to you and tell you what I think you want to hear. And then I'm a phony. So I'm going to tell you that I don't know if it's going to work. But when the Bills do win a Super Bowl, and the law of averages say that they'll eventually win a Super Bowl at some point, that we will then look back on how it all began, and this is how it will have started. This type of situation, a coach and a general manager coming in together as partners. And I didn't use this analogy at the time, but I've since used it on a couple of podcasts this week. Like you said, McBean, as they were called. To me, it was like Lennon and McCartney. They wrote the songs, and you didn't know. Now, of course, you probably know who wrote Yellow Submarine, and you know who wrote Come Together, right? You can guess. McCartney they had their differences, but they always shared the credit. And some of them, you don't know who really wrote the song. And that was how it worked for so long with these two guys. Is, yes, you could look at 13 seconds, and Brandon Beane really doesn't have anything to do with 13 seconds. But then maybe you look at a Boogie Basham pick, or if Terry Pegula opened the door to say that, anybody could possibly be making these picks on the Keon Coleman screw up. But in general, these guys did it together, and it was healthy, and it worked. And at some point they got sideways on some point, and it fell apart. I used the word dissolve, and Terry and Brandon kind of focused on the word dissolve, but that was my question. One of my questions during the news conference was, these guys used to be in lockstep, and at some point the partnership dissolved. When did that happen? Now they focused on the word dissolve, to which I said, look, at some point one guy got fired and the other guy got promoted. Where's the disconnect? And then they finally answered the question, they sidestepped it really by talking about how disagreeing is really healthy with collaboration. Well, that didn't really answer why one guy had to go and the other guy gets a bear hug. One guy gets the kiss of death and the other guy gets a bear hug.
Yeah, one thing Pegula said that I thought was rather telling too was when he mentioned that other executives around the league or other owners around the league at league meetings praise Brandon Beane in the front office and the collection of talent they have in the front office, and kind of imply that other owners that Terry Pegula is friendly with are envious of the front office that the Bills have. And it was never mentioned that he gets any type of praise like that for the coaching staff. And maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. I took it to read that, Terry Pegula's friends in ownership of other NFL teams have given him more praise for Brandon Beane and the assistant GMs than Sean McDermott and Sean McDermott's coaching staff and the coordinators, where there may be some weaknesses over the years in those positions. And if you think of it, Terry Pegula is very close with Stan Kroenke, and Stan Kroenke owning the Rams, and his coach Sean McVay. And maybe Terry Pegula is looking at it, wanting his version of Sean McVay, and Sean McDermott is an excellent coach who did an excellent job with the Buffalo Bills over the last 9 years, but he is different in the way he approaches the job and his personality and his track record than the trend of hot young NFL coaches these days. And it maybe seems like Terry Pegula wants to see what his team looks like with one of these hotshot young coaches, or at least interviewing all of these guys and picking among that group of guys. And just the general thought that maybe an offensive coach will have more success in the playoffs with Josh Allen than a defensive-minded head coach. Uh, and that Brandon Beane is capable of leading a search to find that coach and building a roster for that type of coach. And a lot of things Brandon Beane's been criticized for with wide receivers and the makeup of the offense. I do think Sean McDermott and the coaching staff has some responsibility in that. I think Sean McDermott influenced, building the offense around tight ends and fullbacks and running the ball and being two-dimensional and complementary football. And Joe Brady took over, and all of a sudden they de-emphasized Stephon Diggs, and it was everybody eats, and they didn't need a true number one receiver. And I think Brandon Beane started putting together a roster that fit what the coach's vision was for the offense. And then Brandon Beane took a lot of criticism for how he constructed the wide receiver room, which I don't believe was at odds with how the coaching staff wanted the wide receiver room to be structured, at least coming into the season. Now, when it didn't work out, maybe Sean McDermott asked for, some changes there that Brandon Beane wasn't able to execute on. Brandon Beane says he tried to make trades at the trade deadline to bring in more wide receiver talent and did not, but he did sign Brandon Cooks and signed Mecole Hardman and signed Elijah Moore earlier in the year, brought back Gabe Davis. They tried bringing in more wide receivers. They just never found the right mix that made it any better. And the Keon Coleman pick is really the ultimate failure of the wide receiver room.
Let's talk about the Keon Coleman exchange. I don't know how much you want to get into it because it was a sidebar that really turned into maybe the main headline, but maybe it's not because of Keon Coleman specifically, but just the fact that Terry Pegula would step in it like that and reemphasize that this might not be the cleanest front office operation that Bills fans probably hoped or had imagined. But I mentioned this on Pat Moran's podcast the other night, and I'm going to reiterate it. When it came to Keon Coleman, really when it comes to anything that was said in that news conference by either Brandon Beane or Terry Pegula, there are three options I see. Three options on any word that came out of either man's mouth. They're either lying, they're mistaken, or they're telling the truth. Let's take each one at it. And I think that when it came to what Terry Pegula did in that moment to talk about Keon Coleman is troubling. If he's telling the truth, then that means Brandon Beane was lying when he came back later and corrected Terry Pegula, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he was like, no, Terry didn't have that right. I made the pick. And plus, we saw the receipts. The Bills had their behind the scenes documentary in which they are at the combine. The scouts are talking up Keon Coleman and being able to get him because of his bad 40-yard dash time. And then a interview with Brandon Beane specifically about how when he went to bed that night, Thursday night after the first round, it was Keon Coleman was going to be the pick. And he was owning it. He wasn't saying, how the coaches really loved him or anything. That was our guy. And they were certain of it. All right. So that's if Terry Pegula was telling the truth, or he was mistaken about a prominent player on his team, the 33rd overall pick just 2 years ago. He doesn't remember it correctly, perhaps. Maybe he's got things mixed up about Keon Coleman and I don't know, somebody else, or I don't know what, but that's problematic if the owner of the team can't keep his memory in line regarding how they drafted Keon Coleman or why they did, or he was lying. And perhaps his intentions were good. As we've spoken throughout this podcast, the mission being to protect Brandon Beane, Terry decided he just wanted to step in front of that question and take it. take it on to protect Brandon, who, as he said, has been taking too much criticism for that pick and has sat here and took it. And that's admirable to do. But for Terry to do that would mean that, I mean, just to protect Brandon Beane, maybe he just got a little overzealous and told a fib.
Well, so first of all, the question wasn't about Keon Coleman. It was about what
Keon Coleman was referenced within the question. It was about the receivers in general, but Keon Coleman's name was mentioned. So it triggered the
I
name
guess I
Keon
didn't.
Coleman
All right.
triggered Terry Pegula.
Yeah. I interpreted it as a question about this past year with wide receivers.
It was.
And within that, Brandon Beane has used Keon Coleman in a year ago as part of the reason why the Bills didn't draft another wide receiver, because they had drafted Keon Coleman the year before and still believed in his development. And this question seemed to be more about wide receivers and the rant on WGR and things like that. And it was a question directed at Brandon Beane. Terry Pegula did not need to say anything and certainly did not need to offer any commentary on the Keon Coleman draft pick in answering that general question about wide receivers. All that said, I do think it's somewhere between mistaken and telling the truth. I think it's what Terry Pegula believes is the truth. He was trying to tell us what he thinks the truth is, or the truth that we need to know, and defend Brandon Beane. I mean, Terry Pegula probably listens to a little too much WGR and was trying to speak directly to that audience or those hosts and saying that your criticisms of Brandon Beane over the wide receivers and Keon Coleman are off base, and this was more of an organizational move to draft Keon Coleman and build the wide receiver unit the way that they did. But yes, Brandon Beane later clarified that what Terry Pegula said wasn't entirely accurate, or at least the wording of it was entirely accurate. He said, what it was a difference in ranking between the personnel staff and the coaching staff, and implied that the coaching staff, or one specific coach maybe, was much higher on Keon Coleman than the consensus was, and that Brandon Beane ultimately decided on making the pick, but kind of went with the coaching staff evaluation in terms of deciding to select Keon Coleman. Now, he traded down twice there. He wasn't so enamored with Keon Coleman that they could have taken him with the 27th pick earlier in the draft. They traded down twice to take him at the top of the second round instead of with their first round pick. And I do believe that maybe Brandon Beane believed there were other players at other positions that were graded higher on the board that might have been more worthy of drafting at 27 or 33, but the Bills wanted to draft a wide receiver that was perceived to be needed by the team and the offensive coaching staff, and we're going to land on drafting Keon Coleman one way or the other. But the way the board was falling, there could have been other players, perhaps even other wide receivers that were ranked higher on the board, but Keon Coleman was the player they went into the draft thinking they were going to land at some point, is my interpretation of it. But it was interesting because I do think the subtext is way worse than the text, that the actual words that Terry Pegula said weren't that inflammatory towards Keon Coleman. He didn't really insult Keon Coleman with anything
But he
said.
certainly indicated he doesn't like Keon Coleman, right? Because if this was something to shield anybody from, it is because.
Well, I think you can read into it. I think it was more like parents who are disappointed in their children and sort of trying to blame their spouse instead of themselves a little bit. Or, I guess in this case, Terry Pegula was the grandfather, and he was trying to blame Sean McDermott or the coaching staff instead of Brandon Beane for Keon Coleman's lack of development or not working out as a draft pick so far. But it's the subtext. It's everything that's happened with Keon Coleman and Keon Coleman's disappointing career so far, because that statement could have been made about a draft pick or a player who's really good, but to point out, like, for example, Brandon Beane didn't want to select Josh Allen. He thought Josh Rosen was better, but the coaching staff really wanted Josh Allen, so Brandon Beane was a team player, and he took Josh Allen. That's not what happened. But you could say that about a player who's good, and it wouldn't be as dramatic or as insulting. But it's because Keon Coleman has not worked out and has had these maturity issues and being benched for being late that made it more shocking that Terry Pegula came out and said what he said, and also that you don't hear owners say that specifically about players too often, and that he didn't need to, that he felt the need to interrupt a question that wasn't asked of him to, throw these subliminal shots at Keon Coleman. And it hurts the Bills' position in terms of trying to bring Keon Coleman into the fold and get him to buy in and develop into the program under a new coach. And now Keon Coleman learning that, not everybody in the personnel department is a big fan of his, or was as big of a fan of his as the coaches who might not be back next year. And also, if the Bills feel like, they need to move on from Keon Coleman and trade him, that hurt his trade value. Now the rest of the league knows uh, what the Bills thought about Keon Coleman on draft day, and what the owner thinks about him now, and that's going to hurt their ability to recoup value in a possible trade for Keon Coleman. So it was an unfortunate statement, but from my perspective, and I would hope some Bills fans' perspective, appreciated the insight and the honesty, because you never really knew why they drafted Keon Coleman, why they traded down twice, passed on the other receivers, and with him not working out the way that he did, how surprised are the Bills, or did they really think Keon Coleman was going to be a lot better than this, or a lot more ready to contribute in year one and year two?
I talked to a source close to Coleman in the camp there, and he has not requested a trade. He was confused by what Pegula had to say at first, but then shook him off and went about his day. He was in Dallas with Terrell Shavers, who was having knee surgery on Wednesday when he learned about what Pegula had to say, and um, so at least Coleman doesn't seem as though he is going to make a big stink about this. But you have to wonder how this lingers and if this impacts his off season. And I don't know, it gets inside your head. I mean, here's a guy who's already got a problem with dropping footballs, and if he starts straining a little bit more, or clenching, or worried about things, and who knows? I mean, these are the types of. I mean, he seems to be a bit of a fragile quantity right now, with his inability to stay on the field, to follow rules, to catch the football, and things can go any number of directions. But through 2 years, we haven't seen much mental toughness out of Keon Coleman. And if now, knowing that the owner isn't a fan of his, and the owner is claiming that the personnel department or the scouts aren't necessarily a fan of his, and now, Terry Pegula later clarified to the Associated Press's John Warrow, another F of the show, that he wasn't referring to Sean McDermott regarding those comments, the coaching staff. Well, does that mean that Keon Coleman's got an ally who's going to be out of a job? Because are they going to have a new receivers coach next year? And now this guy isn't the guy who wanted me, or whoever the hell it was, Joe Brady, whatever. I don't know. But Keon Coleman's got a lot to think about. And I think that he strikes me as a guy that the less he thinks, the better. So,
And
anyway,
remember, now he said it after the pick, but Josh Allen was very praising of the Keon Coleman draft pick, and indicated that he was texting Brandon Beane and liked his style of play in his game, and that if it wasn't Keon Coleman specifically, they seemed to want that type of receiver, the big athletic contested catch guy that Keon Coleman and they're hoping develops into uh, a better version of that as his career goes along. What if Terry Pegula had interjected there and say, that was my pick. I'm the owner, and there was a disagreement over who was the best wide receiver on the board, and I said Keon Coleman's the guy I want.
that would be even more
Now,
terrifying, wouldn't it, to the fans?
well,
It'd be
right,
like,
that
holy shit, this guy's that's what Ralph used to do.
Yeah, well, and it's funny you bring that up, because I thought this was a very Ralph Wilson-esque performance from Terry Pegula throughout that whole press conference, and I missed that about Ralph kind of being able to express his own thoughts and his own feelings and his own control over the team, and not keep that to himself. But anyways, if Terry Pegula had said something to that effect, it would have done the same way of protecting Brandon Beane, but there wouldn't have been any of this. How could the owner say that about a player on his team? And how can Keon Coleman ever come back to that organization ever again. And it still wouldn't have been something that an owner should come out and say publicly when he's not asked about the player specifically. But it would have been different. You know what I mean? It wouldn't have been as insulting or as inflammatory.
Yeah, I agree with that. What are your thoughts on Josh Allen being involved in the interview process for the next head coach?
Well, he should be, right? I don't know if it would be, I don't know if that's
I think
much of
it
a hot
depends on to
take.
what
And
degree, but it does come with some risks.
maybe I'd like to hear your take on the risk because I do think that, well, so here's my analysis of that. I mean, I don't think you give it totally to Josh Allen. And like, for example, if Josh Allen wants Davis Webb just because that's who he's closest with personally, and you hire, I don't think it should be like a situation like LeBron James hiring JJ Redick. You know, I think that Josh Allen should have input, but not have the final say. But I do think this. I think that, and I'm not necessarily of this belief, but I think most Bills fans and even most NFL observers are of the belief that it is all about Josh Allen. Josh Allen is the center of the Bills universe, and that this coach has to be the coach that maximizes his talents and abilities and preferences, and you know, an offensive head coach that is perfect for Josh Allen's style of play. And if that's the case, Sean McDermott is not that coach. So it does add some logic to where they're going and what they're doing. And Brandon Beane is the general manager that scouted Josh Allen and selected Josh Allen with assistance from the rest of the front office and Terry Pagula probably, but made all the different trades to move up to draft Josh Allen, didn't sit back and take the quarterback that fell to him later in the draft, didn't take Josh Rosen or Lamar Jackson or another quarterback. Josh Allen was the guy they wanted and the guy they got, and Brandon Beane worked very hard at that. And you know, let's not forget, Sean McDermott ran the draft, we think, or had a heavy hand in the draft the year before. Did not draft Patrick Mahomes, did not draft Deshaun Watson, who didn't work out, but at the time looked like, you know, a good player to take at that time. Uh, Drafted Nathan Peterman, was Nathan Peterman's, you know, biggest fan, it seemed like, for a year or so. Started Nathan Peterman in the first game of Josh Allen's rookie year, and seemed to come around on Josh Allen a little bit later than
Well, I don't think
Brandon
though
Beane.
that I I mean to go back into that moment, I don't think that he viewed Nathan Peterman as the future of the organization, but I think in a perfect world, much like Mahomes what was doing with Kansas City, the Bills viewed the perfect scenario as Josh Allen sits and learns this year. And Nathan Peterman, you can go out there and get sacked, every third play if you
Sure.
want. And Josh Allen,
Yeah.
but it was such a
Uh,
disaster. Nathan
right.
Peterman couldn't wasn't man wasn't plausible.
Yeah, right. But I think Sean McDermott's vision of the quarterback he wanted and the offense he wanted and where Josh Allen fits in that seems different than Brandon Beane's vision and different coaches and Brian Dable and different coordinators that they've had. And he was slower, I think, to embrace Josh Allen style of play. There was some friction earlier in the career. I think some of the stuff in seasons past about wanting Josh Allen to run less and protect the football more and not play as much in the spread formations and let Josh be Josh. I don't know if Sean McDermott was as strong of an advocate of that as different
Neither was
offensive
Terry
coordinators have
Pagula.
been.
Terry Pagula did not like that.
Okay, okay. But my point is this, that you know, if you are of the belief that it's all about Josh Allen and it's all about uh, getting the best out of Josh Allen, and that's how the Bills win the Super Bowl, I do think that there are coaches out there that are better for that than Sean McDermott, and that Josh Allen should be involved in the process of finding that coach. Because if you do hire another defensive coach, or you do hire another offensive coach that wants Josh Allen to play differently than he's at his best, uh, I don't see how the Bills gain from that analysis.
Yeah, I think that so I'm writing a story about it that will be at the Athletic tomorrow, and I'm in the process of writing it. I haven't finished it, but I've interviewed Kurt Warner for it, and I may be speaking. I've been exchanging some texts with Bruce Arians, and he's unvarnished, as you know. Sometimes you can hear the ice actually clinking in the glass when you interview Bruce Arians if it's later in the day. So this is my take on it before I share a little bit about what Kurt Warner had to say. Is that I think it's risky because now Josh Allen is going to wear this selection. His fingerprints are going to be on it. And it provides some cover for Brandon Beane because now it's a collaboration. Now, Brandon Beane has consolidated power, and yet it will be a collaboration. And if it doesn't work out, then Josh Allen's going to have to own that, at least a part of it. We're not going to know how much, just like we didn't know who made what pick or, the Lennon and McCartney analogy that I used earlier. But there's all kinds of things. What if they don't pick his guy? Will he be upset if he really wants somebody and they say, you know what, Josh, he's better for the organization than maybe he would be than this guy would be for the offense. And how does he respond to that? What if Josh Allen likes a couple guys and they pick this is what Kurt Warner said here. I'll even give the quote here.
Well, real quick, also
Sure.
Josh Allen's track record. He wanted Ken Dorsey to be the offensive coordinator, and that didn't work out.
Right.
And I guess Joe Brady did work out, but I don't know if Josh Allen has proven to be the best evaluation of the coaches to coach him in what we've gotten from him so far.
Right. Bear with me for a second here. I'm looking back through my notes. Ryan Fitzpatrick, by the way, on his podcast, he was talking about how the Bills need a coach who is going to push Josh Allen because he thinks Josh Allen has more to give. You don't want a buddy. You don't want to bring in a guy that's just want to be Josh Allen's pal and want to go golfing with Josh and be, which is kind of some of the criticism that Brian Dable got, and Davis Webb has been a name mentioned around. So here is Kurt Warner, who had four or five different NFL coaches. He played with three different organizations. I don't know if I'm an expert on being able to pick a head coach. Sean McDermott was fired. Why was he fired? Does Josh Allen even know exactly why? Because from the outside, it looked like Sean McDermott did so many things right. We've got to make sure the next coach does all the same things right and then does the next thing that we're looking for to put us over the top. So the overriding thing with Kurt Warner's sentiment was, does Josh Allen really know what he's looking at when it comes to a head coach? And here's a guy who had said Josh Allen's had one his entire NFL career. He's been in the league a while. He's had one. Kurt Warner is saying, even at this age, at 54 years old, he doesn't know if he could pick a head coach. So I asked him, is there, what's the risk or what? And he said, I would have no problem putting my name on the line for anything that I was confident and comfortable in. How invested is Josh? How comfortable does he feel about picking the coach if asked? But as a player, I don't know what I don't know or what boxes I need to check or make sure that this guy's the right guy. That could be tough to be stamped with. Let's say Josh liked two guys and they hired the third guy. Even if it's not a guy Josh endorsed, if he was part of the process, he's going to be tied to that in some way, shape, or form if it doesn't work out. So that was a bit of a diplomat. It wasn't like the guy doesn't deserve it. In my text, this will be reflected in my story, but in my text, Bruce Arians says that Josh Allen's earned the right to be at the table. But I think that the sentiment being is you can't let him pick him. It depends on how much say he has. Maybe he's got some questions to ask. Is Terry Pegula doing these head coaching interviews with his home office people, his petroleum executives? From what I understand, that may be the case. Who's involved? Who's asking these questions? Is Brandon Beane get the final decision? Does Terry Pegula make an emotional decision? He said that he did in firing McDermott. Maybe the guy comes down to Terry's gut. Maybe Terry's gut says, I know everybody's like, but this is the guy I want, Brandon. And he has that right as the owner. And I think that it's fair to wonder. So That's just
I,
my thought. I
yeah,
just on Josh Allen's involvement. We don't know to what degree, and we probably will never know to what degree.
yeah, and I also think this. Now, I agree with the belief that you probably do want an offensive-minded head coach that uh, maximizes Josh Allen, but I just think that's how I think an NFL team gives itself the best chance to win a Super Bowl. I think for the Bills right now, whoever they select as the head coach, it's very important how that coach approaches the defensive side of the ball and the defensive coordinator hire and the scheme, because I think where this could really go badly is if it develops similarly to when Rex Ryan came in and the Bills had an excellent defense under coordinator Jim Schwartz, head coach Doug Marrone, and you thought Rex Ryan as a defensive head coach that's had success on the defensive side of the ball with other teams with the talent the Bills had, that the defense would only get better, but it ended up getting worse. And because those defensive players that were excellent in Jim Schwartz's scheme didn't quite fit Rex Ryan's scheme, and there were transition to with the free agent signings and draft picks to get different types of defensive players, and the defensive holdovers didn't quite understand Rex Ryan's defense or weren't playing Rex Ryan's defense as well as Rex Ryan wanted them to play, and the defense got much, much worse. And if that happens again, uh, the Bills aren't going to win a Super Bowl with a below average defense. And as good as the offense is, I think the defense needs to be as good or better than it's been over the last few years under Sean McDermott, or as good as it was when it was very good under Sean McDermott. So I don't know if they need the exact same defensive coaching, but it shouldn't go too far in a different direction. And, the offense is probably going to be pretty good, if not definitely Super Bowl caliber, no matter who the coach is, with Josh Allen and the offensive lineman they have and James Cook. But the defense could get a lot worse if they don't handle this correctly.
They might have a lot of work to do on that offensive line because of who is a free agent and the fact that Aaron Cromer is retiring and the amount of respect that he had. David Edwards came to Buffalo to play for him, as did Connor McGovern. And who on the staff is going to be retained? That when Aaron Cromer was when he announced his retirement and before McDermott had been fired, who knows? I mean, you just say, well, we can move things up and get different guys. Maybe you lose Joe Brady, maybe you lose whomever, but Kyle Shermer from offensive quality control, or Mark Lubick, gets moved in there, but not as offensive line coach. That would be Austin Gunn. He was the assistant offensive line coach. But if Cromer's gone, it's a more seamless thing. If his protege just moves in and takes over, but now he might not get that job because who knows what this new coach comes in with. He's got his own set of dudes that he wants to work with, and offensive line coach is an important one, especially if that offensive line coach serves as your run game coordinator. So yeah, the Bills offensive line, there's a lot of question marks there that are going to be maybe not even answered by who the next head coach is. But it's going to be a significant offseason for that segment of the team.
Yeah, and two starters going into free agency, David Edwards and Connor McGovern. They do have work to do.
Two guys who
Yeah,
who are here to play for Aaron Cromer.
right. And I believe Reggie Gilliam, also a free agent. But Deion Dawkins probably still on the team. Spencer Brown still on the team. Osiris Torrance still on the team. Jackson Hawes is a blocking tight end. Like, they have some work to do, but I don't think it's a total bare bones rebuild on the offensive line, and probably will, if they're not the best offensive line in the league last year, which sometimes you maybe could say that about the Bills offensive line the last couple of years. I still think they'll be very good up front.
Yeah, a bit of a polarized offensive line in that they block for the NFL's leading rusher, but Josh Allen took more sacks than he has in his entire career.
How does it affect the Bills' offense if they outlaw the tush push? Because they were just excellent with that this year, not just in short yardage, but
Sean McDermott's not on the competition committee anymore unless he gets another job in the NFL. If he decides to take a year off, or who knows, maybe he might not be on the competition committee anymore. So that's one more voice on that committee that might not that wouldn't be able to vote it down or make a recommendation. Jonah, I know we've been at this for a long time. Do we want to talk about the Sabres real quick, or do we just want to save that for next week? The Sabres keep playing games. We don't have to talk about the Sabres.
I say we talk about them real quick and save maybe more thorough discussions for next week, but they're playing great. Their last 21 games, they've won 17. They have the most points in the NHL, 35 in that span since December 19th. They're on pace for 100 points, which is definitely going to get them in the playoffs. They're 2 points away from the divisional playoff spot. I don't think they're going to get up into the top 4 to have home ice advantage in the first round, but they are looking like they're in the mix to get the 5th or the 6th seed and be more of a solid playoff team than a team that needs to win the last 2 games of the year to get in the wild card or something like that. There's still time on the schedule for things to go in a different direction, but I don't think you can be cynical about that 10-game winning streak anymore, because they've now gone 11 games since, winning in different ways and sustaining their success. And it does look like they're continuing to pick up steam, or at least keep their momentum going. And, their playoff odds are about 60% or higher in the different models. And it seems like they're trending towards definitely making the playoffs, which even at the start of that 10-game win streak, it was like, wow, this is great that they've saved the season, but they still have a long way to go.
A question I received via text from another friend of the show, Scooter Vertino, who asks me after the game last night, here's the question: is UPL an actual dude, to borrow a basketball term? To which I said no. But do you think, at this stage, I think we would have seen more
consistency
from UPL to say that he could be the man, capital T, capital M.
So I think it depends what you mean by dude, because when I think about that with basketball, I think about recruiting, and it's about size and athletic ability. And I do think UPL has the size and the uh, physical talent to be one of the better goaltenders in the leagues. I think it's more his mentality and consistency that you question. So I actually think UPL is a potential dude, uh, but he hasn't put it together consistently enough to actually, say that with, I think he's a dude with a lowercase d.
He's dude-ish.
Yeah, he's a dudette.
Oh, well, careful. All right, Jonah, let's wrap it up. There's been enough to discuss, and I got a story to write. Thanks to everybody out there who've been supporting Tim Graham and Friends, for all the likes and the subscribes and the comments and the ratings. We thank you. They continue to pile up and help us do what we want to do. Hopefully we have something to announce here fairly soon regarding Tim Graham and Friends. We are plugging away and having a good time doing it.
And to that, I say big if true.
Big if true. Okay. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll catch you next time on Tim Graham and Friends.
Thank you.